In this lesson, we'll talk about making component holding features. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to apply sketch constraints and create an extruded feature. Carrying on with the file from our previous example with XStar component active, let's add a few more features in here to hold our components. Now, as we're looking at the ESCs, I don't really mind the fact that this rightmost ESC can float around a bit in here. I don't want to have any features that are keeping it a specific distance from this wall because I feel like the extra flexibility might help when we do an install. What I do want to make sure I have in here is a feature that helps keep these two apart because they do create a lot of heat. We want to make sure that they're not sitting right up against each other and actually creating too much heat or more heat than is needed. Now we have ESCs that are quite a bit overkill for our design at this point. They're 40 amp ESCs, and they're 40 amp because we're having the flexibility or the ability to go up to a 4-cell battery system, and at which point our motors will pull up to about 36 amps each. So these 40 amp ESCs allow us to go up to that 4-cell battery system. In our current configuration, max, they're going to pull 27 amps per, so we actually could go to a smaller ESC that takes up less space, potentially produces less heat. But since we're only going to be pulling a little bit more than 50%, these are going to be fairly cool in the grand scheme of things. So let's go ahead and select the bottom face and create another sketch. And this time again, we're going to do rectangles, and I'm going to come in, and again, I want to make sure that we're not snapping to any geometry. You can hold down the control key to override that. And we're going to place a single rectangle here, a single rectangle here, and then I want to place two more over here. Now the reason I want to do that is because I want to make sure that I positively locate this ESC. I also am going to come in and place a line in here. I'm going to select the line and press X on the keyboard to turn it into a construction line. It's going to allow me to mirror these across to the other side when I do my extrude. Now, this geometry is fairly simple. We could still mirror it as a feature or as a sketch, but I'm going to go ahead and just do it as a sketch in this instance. Now it's time to add some constraints. Because we're going to be adding several of the same constraints, I'm going to start by deselecting everything. I'm going to scroll down to my collinear constraint, and then I'm going to select each individual line. This collinear constraint will allow me to get around making an equal constraint between the vertical lines. I'll then hit escape. I'm going to come down to an equal, and I'm going to make sure that the length of each of these is going to be equal. That way I have a consistent wall thickness and a consistent print. And then I'm going to hit escape, and I'm going to go ahead and dimension these. I'm going to make this one here 3 millimeters. I'm going to give them a distance apart of 8 millimeters. And I also want to make sure that I have a certain distance from this inside wall. I'm going to make that 11 millimeters. The next thing that we need to make sure is that we're a certain distance from either the top or the bottom edge. So I'm going to come from this edge right here. I'm going to come to this internal edge, and we'll call that 54 millimeters. And you'll notice that the last thing that we need to define is the height of each of these. I'm going to make this and this equal. That way I have a perfect square. The next thing that we want to do is we want to add a few more collinear relations because that'll help us keep these in the correct orientation without having to add any additional dimensions. So make sure that everything is deselected. Then you can pre-select collinear, and we can add a collinear between these two verticals as well as these two verticals. So now the last thing we need to do is determine what the height location of these is going to be. We can come back in here and we can add that equal constraint to make sure that these are perfect squares. And now the only thing that we need to do is decide what the vertical positioning is going to be. We'll dimension it from the bottom of this edge to the top of this one, a distance of 20 millimeters. So as we look at this, I'm going to go ahead and turn off show constraints. We have 4 squares, and these are going to allow us to have some sort of positioning to help us locate where these ESCs can sit. It'll also help keep them upright so they don't start to fall over and it'll help us with our wiring and pre-wiring to make sure everything's in the right location. We're going to go to Sketch. We're going to create a sketch mirror, and we're going to mirror these 4 squares. So we'll have to select each of these edges. We can also use the box selection, or we can zoom into each one. Once you have all 4 selected, we'll use the vertical construction line we created as the mirror and say OK. We can now stop the sketch and create an extrude. We want to make sure that we select all 8 of these squares. And again, we want to be careful not to add too much mass where it's not needed. Now in this case, if we come up a distance of 10 millimeters, that should be enough to make sure that we have the ESCs in the right place. If you want to go up a little bit more, we can go to 15. But at some point, we have to be careful because we're adding mass and we're adding these tall walls, but the taller they get, the easier they're going to be to break. So 15 is probably going to be about the limit. And if we want to add a bit more structure to them, we can add a small fillet or chamfer in these corners. We'll go ahead and add one in between each of these. We'll do the same thing for the other side as well. Let's say 5 millimeters. And now we're adding a bit more structure to that. Now we can add it on the back side as well, but that's going to be enough to help keep them in place. And we can say OK. So at that point, that helps keep the ESCs in their location with a little bit of extra room on this back side to let this first one float, depending on how much room we need to get these wires around these bosses where the screws are going to be. The last 2 things that we need to make sure are positively located are going to be the power distribution board and the flight controller. And the flight controller is going to be the most critical in terms of positioning. And the power distribution board, we just want to make sure that it's in roughly the right location. Now, as we rotate this around, the power distribution board itself has a small gap from the bottom, and that's okay because that's what we want, and we're actually going to be screwing that in. What we're going to do is I'm going to hold down the left mouse button, and I'm going to select the bottom face, and then I want to start a new sketch on that face. Then I'm going to use the P key to project the mounting holes for each corner. Now this is a standard bolt pattern, and if you decide later on to change the flight controller, use a different flight controller or a different power distribution board, this is a pretty standard bolt pattern, and you can use multiple power distribution boards or even flight controllers like the full-size CC3D. We're using a micro CC3D here, but the full-size one actually shares the same bolt pattern, and it can be very handy to use that functionality. So now that we have those 4 bolt locations, what we want to do is we want to start a circle at each of these points. So sometimes you might have to zoom in depending on other geometry that it might be trying to snap to. And I'm simply going to just draw 4 larger circles for right now, but I want to make sure that they're centered on these holes. So you notice because of the grid snaps that oftentimes it tries to snap to those locations, and making sure that you're snapping only to the center point of those circles. Once we have those, we need to decide the diameter of the hole that we're going to be creating in here, as well as the size of the boss. So we're going to start by making all 4 of these circles equal. I'm going to come back over here, and we're going to make these 2 equal, and back to the original, and this one equal as well. So I'm going to make this 6 millimeter diameter, so give us a nice large pad where we can attach to. And as we look at this board, you can see that it slightly overlaps a few things. There's a small hole here, and that's a through hole. That could potentially produce some problems if we have wires run to it. So instead of 6, I'm going to reduce it to 5 and make sure that I don't have any overlap here. Next, I want to make sure that I add a hole that's going to be an okay size for the screw that we're going to use. And in our case, we're going to be using a 3 millimeter screw, and this is plastic, and we're going to be using a thread forming screw. So in this case, 2.5 will be the bare minimum for the size that we're going to use. And I'm actually going to go all the way down to 2 millimeters in this case. And that's going to give me plenty of meat or plenty of material. And that way, whenever I screw that first time into the plastic, it'll create a nice deep thread for me to use. And that way I know that I'm holding the power distribution board in a nice location and it's fixed. So once I have that first one designated, I'm going to come down, select equal, and I'm going to go back and make all of the new circles that I sketched. I'm going to make them all equal to that internal 2 millimeter size. Once I have those, I can stop the sketch, create an extrude, and again I'm going to have to hold down that left mouse button. I can also come in and I can hide the power distribution board, and the power distribution board will help by allowing us to see the sketch without having to accidentally select the geometry. So the profile that we want is going to include the larger OD 5 millimeter as well as the small distance between that and the 2 millimeter. So make sure that you select all of those, and then we're going to extrude up to object, and we're going to select the inside of, in this case, our package tray or the component tray, and it's going to join. Right now, let's go ahead and save so we can move on to the last step of mounting that flight controller before we finish off the shape of our package tray or component tray.